That horse bucked across a 5-foot fence, cleared it while he was bucking, and Philip hung on. Could not throw him. And it was about 4 or 5 minutes later, he was galloping that horse around the fence. And here, looking up on the highway, here there's 4 or 5 cars, just guys shouting out the window, "Ride him, ride him!" So we had many a rodeo. And thing is, living there in southern Alberta too, that I really missed was everybody knew everybody. It wasn't like today. You could stop in at your neighbors. I mean, Saturday night we'd go down to the neighbor Yoshowishi's, and they were Chinese or Japanese. They were Japanese, and they had all these guys living at their place, Sachi and all these guys with martial arts. They were all black belt martial art people. So Philip was fascinated with them. So what does he do? Brings them up to Hofer's. They just come straight over from Asia, couldn't speak any English, and so he's feeds them good. And I remember he goes up to brings them out, and they're on Uncle Jake's lawn one night. And so of course Philip wants to learn martial arts. So these guys were so fast, so unbelievably fast. I mean, they could flip backwards, frontwards, go way in the air. They could kick so fast it sounded like the crap of a bullwhip. And what I remember is Philip says they're not that strong. They're just extremely tough, but they don't have brute strength. And I was terrified of them because there were nice guys in that, but you never want to get a fight. They could handle knives, they could handle all kinds of stuff. They were trained to fight, they were trained to kill. So I remember Philip saying, "Yeah, show us how to fight." And he says, "No, no fight, no fight. We play, only play." And so Uncle Jake, he come up, big old Uncle Jake, tough Uncle Jake. He says, "I'm going to show these guys what to do." And he tried to grab one of these guys, and the next thing there was Uncle Jake, his 280 pounds, lying flat out with the wind knocked out of him on his lawn. And so then Philip said to Sachi, I remember Sachi was the fastest one. He says, "Let me hold you and see if you can get away." Well, Philip, if once he got him and held him, he couldn't get away, couldn't move. But if his hands were free, you could never catch him, you could never touch him. So he always had these guys with the martial arts out on the place. And I remember we would help Yoshoishi. He would be a beet farmer, and Philip would go up there and help them do their beets. And these guys had machetes. These guys that did the martial arts, and the beets come off of a conveyor. They were pulling. This machine was pulling beets out of the ground onto a conveyor and onto the truck, and driving beside the truck, they were harvesting the beets. And these guys' machetes moved so fast you couldn't see them move, but they chopped off the top of the beets, the green. Unbelievable precision. But that's something I remember, and that really inspired Philip. He says, "How can the human eye even see so fast and react so fast to cut the greens off the beets as they're coming off of a harvester? That's 2, 3 beats a second." And them guys would stand there with their machetes, and you just hear it. It sounded like the wind, just whoop, 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 and the top of them beats was gone. That's what I remember. Yoshuishi, he was the best fun-loving neighbor, beautiful wife, beautiful daughters, sons. We'd go down to his place Saturday nights and watch the streets of San Francisco, Ironside, and a few old movies that today would be, well, today you'd call them church movies, let alone. There wasn't garbage on the TV. Anyway, so everybody knew everybody, and if a neighbor needed help, you would go help him. And the neighbors come around all the time. Hey, I need some help to do this. And we'd jump in the truck and go help the neighbor. The other thing is, too, this was all before seat belts. I remember this dash was steel, and dash was steel. I remember it was Johnny R's old blue truck. And Philip, one day he takes us down to Henniger Ranch in this old blue truck. Beautiful old truck. If a guy would have saved that truck up today, it would be worth a mint. It would be a super nice sports truck. But anyway, again, if the keys was in the truck, you took it. The person would bellyache like crazy. I mean, if you wanted to go fishing, what you'd do around 3, 4 o'clock, if you found the keys on a pickup, you pulled the keys out, and that meant that you had that truck that night to go fishing. If you didn't pull the keys out, then somebody else would take that truck. So the old people were always belly aching. Where's the keys for the truck? Oh, I remember one time we had this hired man from Ontario. His name was Pete. And he he had black hair and thick black eyebrows, and he worked for us a little bit. And one day nobody can find the keys for Uncle John's green Ford pickup. And Philip, do you have the keys? No. Sammy, no. Glenn, no. Jonathan, no. Everybody, nobody has the keys to this pickup. Well, here we asked the new hired man if he's got the keys. He wants to go fishing. We says, look, you can't just come and work for us and do like we do. This is ours. You're the hired man. Well, he didn't like that. He said he's going to go work for somebody else. So he goes to work for somebody else, and a week later, he shows up at our place. And I says, well, Pete, I says, how come you only work for the neighbor for 1 month? And he says, well, he says, I was working real hard, and I was all sweaty and dirty, and the neighbor, he lets himself water in for the tub, and I beat him to his own tub, and he just told me to take a hike. I said, yeah. So, so he beat the neighbor into his bathtub and was back at Hofer Farms trying to do a job. Yeah, what else do I remember about Philip? Yeah, he did. He liked to have a lot of fun. I remember when we grew up, alcohol was just no, no, no. But the old people, they had, I remember Grandma, she had a bottle of 999 wine, and my dad had a bottle in his closet, and I guess a little wine for the stomach's sake. Well, one day I showed Philip where my dad's wine was. In his closet, in his private bedroom behind his clothes. Well, little did I know, he started to go in there whenever he could and do some swigging. And it frustrated my dad so terrible bad that somebody would come into his bedroom in his closet, but I was too scared to tell him that I'm the culprit that told Philip it was there. And so Dad couldn't report to the preachers, otherwise they knew that he'd have wine there, and so he was just in a real fix. So he had to move his wine jug to another location. It's a swimmer, animal lover, horse tamer, weightlifter. Out on the reserve, like I said before, he had the Indians lifting weights. Made friends with all of them. He brought a guy home one day, a black gentleman, onto the farm, and he told me, teach this guy how to run a swather and a tractor. So I had a dirt bike, and this guy would be in the back of my dirt bike, and I took him out, showed him how to run a swather, and he worked for us for about 2 weeks. And it come time to pay him. So we asked for his driver's license. Well, when he come to our place, he had a little green suitcase full of his clothes and his personal belongings. And when we asked to pay him and asked for his driver's license, he took off and left. And here I get the Reader's Digest, and here this black guy's picture is on the Reader's Digest. He had murdered people, girls specifically, from New York all the way in the Dakotas, and his name was Tony. And here I had him in the back of my dirt bike, taught him how to do everything. And in the Reader's Digest, it tells how he stops in, seems like to be a real nice guy, shows people these scars on his leg, said that he got them in Vietnam, but it's all a lie. And here he had murdered people all the way along, but we're still here. He could have easily cut my throat from the back of that dirt bike, but I tell you what, I think I drove so hard that all he was worried about is that he could hang on. So Philip brought him around and always bringing people around, pick up all the hitchhikers, witness to them, and they could never be the same. So he'd bring people out to the farm, and a lot of times he'd go into town too, and we'd have dinner with folks, and he'd be witnessing to them and telling them about Jesus. And I remember after getting married, and I got a wife from Pennsylvania, awesome wife. And the church had split probably 3, 4 times, and I was kind of done with it all. I had quit going to any church. One day Philip and his wife, he come to visit Joni and I, and he starts telling me, he says, Sam, I really found something. He says, something tremendous. He says, you know, all that stuff we're doing, that touch not, taste not, handle not, all them standards, that has nothing to do with true salvation. I says, hey, Philip, listen, when it comes to religion, I says, I'm done. I'm just sick of the whole thing. I says, I haven't seen anything. I says, did my best, but it don't work. He says, no. He says, I really found something. He says, just give me a little bit of time, okay? Just let me tell you about it. I says, okay, I mean, this is strange. I figured, let's lift weights, let's have some fun, let's reminisce, but leave the religion alone. I was sick of it. I mean, religion had destroyed, taken all my cousins away, just destroyed my life. I didn't see any good in it at all. It just caused trouble. The old people couldn't get along, and they wrecked everything for us young people. And so I didn't want to hear about him. But anyway, he starts out and he says, let me show you something. And he goes to Matthew 1 and he starts out, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way with sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. He should be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. And I'm sitting there and I'm going, yeah, that sounds real good. By the time the evening was done and he starts showing me some things, he says, we don't have it. He says, it's all about the kingdom of God, and it's about what Jesus did for us 2,000 years ago. And it's not about all this touch not, taste not, handle not, all these rules and regulations. In fact, he says that's old covenant. That has nothing to do with it. By the time he was done, I was just like, wow. I figured, man, Philip, this is some good stuff. What do your people think about it? He said, well, they don't like it. They think I'm off the rocker. And I remember he got up and he started preaching some of this stuff the few times he had devotion, while some of the old Orthodox people in the church just sat there and they wanted nothing to do with it. And they so distorted everything he said, but they were not willing to listen, not willing to change. And but he found what's real, and he moved out and moved away from our place. And I know these are just a few stories about Phil. A little bit about Danny, that Philip always bugged him. I remember the thing about his brother Danny is Danny was very strong. Danny wasn't an animal person. He was more do what's right. Do what's right no matter what it costs. No compromise. You don't say crap if you have a mouthful. You just follow the law. I mean, talk about if you're going to define a good person in a word or deed, he was excellent, super strong. I remember when we'd play hockey, Danny was crazy strong. One guy wanted to fight him. The guy didn't have time to fight him because Danny just picked him up and threw him over the boards. And we were cleaning the ice, and he tried to fight Danny. So Danny has a shovel in his hand. He jumps on Danny. Danny grabs him, throws him over the boards into a snowdrift, grabs a shovel and keeps shoveling like there's nothing going on. I mean, yeah, you didn't mess with him. You messed with him, you was in the bottom. And and he was also a logger. I remember I worked for Danny when I was 17. Philip had bought a logging truck that had went off the end of the ferry. They pulled it out from under the water, or no, it had wrecked the ferry deck. The brakes had given out, and it just got out of the shop. And I went up and worked for Danny and drove that logging truck up in Burns Lake, Vanderhoof. And Danny and I would go to work every morning, 50 miles to work, 50 miles home at night, and just log trees all day. I'd haul 5 loads to the landing every day and tumble them down, just open the side, and then one of these huge loaders would lift off the logs, and I'd drive back and pick up another load. And biggest thing I remember about that is one time I was driving the truck, and this little baby moose was caught in a fence, and the mother was way out in the pasture. So I went over and helped that moose get loose from the fence, and I looked up, and here the mama was coming wide open. I scrambled into that truck so fast, just slammed the door, and her snotty nose was up inside my window. Split second, and she'd have probably trampled me. I didn't know if I should go fly under the truck or if I should go in the truck, but I got in the truck. I have a new respect for moose. They can move. And so worked with Danny, stayed at Danny's place when he just first had little children. Probably Judith was just tiny, and Titus, they were just, yeah, they were in their cribs and stuff like that, probably at that stage. And so, yeah, went down and visited Philip about 2 weeks before he got killed. Had a super good talk with him, very inspirational. And I remember at his funeral, Danny was there, and Danny says, "So when are you going to come visit me?" But he was way up north, and 6 months later, he got killed. I just never forget it. Just drastic times. And oh yeah, I remember one day. Well, I'll talk about Danny. He bought this old 283 Biscayne. This 283 flathead Biscayne, an old white car with these high fenders off the back, and it was his dating car where he'd date Jane, and then he left, and so that old white car was there. Then Philip had that car, and then it was Philip's car for a while. Well, back then too, if the keys weren't left on a car, I remember the car was always parked in Uncle John's place. And I think Philip taught me how to do it. But anyway, back then the key was in the dash, not in the steering wheel, so your steering was never locked. And we would unplug the coupler that went to the key, and we'd take a bobby pin and another little wire, and we just short it out, and you could hot wire any vehicle there was in just minutes back then. And that's why they ended up putting the keys in the steering wheel, so the steering wheel's locked unless you have the key. But man, and there was a couple places you could put the wire in this old 283 Biscayne. And I remember at nighttime, Uncle John had this window where he'd be walking from his kitchen out to the porch, and you could see his head go by the window. And so when I was out there and trying to hotwire this car and steal it for some rendezvous, I would be laying across the seat looking up through the steering wheel, and if I didn't put the bobby pin in the right two holes, the car would just crank and crank and crank and wouldn't start. Well, Uncle John would hear the cranking, and I remember looking up through the steering wheel, and he'd look out into the night because he knew he heard something. And then when he'd wait for the longest time, he'd just stand outside and look into the night. Then he'd go back in the house, and when I seen his head go by the window, I'd put I'd put the bobby pin in two of the other sockets and fire this old car up and tear off. Next morning, where were you last night? Why did you steal the car? And it went on and on. But I hot wired that car so many times, I could do it in the dark without, just by feeling. So that car has a lot of history. I mean, that car could do 120 miles an hour with the lights off and 4 police chasing you. And we ended up putting it inside a pig pen, and there was police all over the place. But the only place they didn't look was in the pig pen, and that's where we was hiding after running away from them with that old white car. 15 years old, crazy, crazy, crazy. But then you'd see the police in the morning, and they'd say, yeah, which one of you guys was it? I mean, everybody knew everybody. The police would threaten you. I remember one day the police come on the place, and I knew he was looking for me, so I ran downstairs in the kitchen behind the refrigerator and hid. And the next thing, I'm being lifted up by one of my ears. He knew where I was downstairs, or somebody snitched on me. And he just pulled my ear and tie into me like they'd never be allowed to do that today. How come you're driving on the highway and you don't even have a license, you know? Yeah, the other thing I remember is when we would drive over to the reservation, on the way over to the reserve, and we'd work. A lot of times Sunday night we'd go over and spend the whole week there. They'd give us bread and bacon and cases of eggs and everything, and they had an old bus fixed up with a stove where we'd sleep, and then they had the camp where we could also sleep with a stove. And so we'd go over there a week at a time, all of us cousins, Philip, Danny, Glenn, myself, Steve, Jonathan, Johnny R. All of us would go over and we'd cultivate and get everything ready to seed. But also our uncles and our cousins, George Walters and his crew, they was also out on the reserve. And Uncle Paul and Uncle George, they had their crew in the reserve. And so when we'd go over there all week, what we would do is a lot of times we'd raid each other's camps. And so we'd go down there and cause trouble and sneak around and try to scare everybody in the middle of the night, because on the reserve you never knew what was happening or who was outside. Just go bang on the camp door or something like that at midnight and run away. But on the way to the reserve, there was a little country store in the town of Spring Coulee with this little old man and this little old lady. And Uncle George Walters, which we all figured had more money than the rest of us, he had a charge account there. So a lot of us would go and we'd buy a pop. You could buy a pop and a Henry bar, which is a super good chocolate bar, and a bag of chips probably for $1, $2, whatever. And the little old lady, she'd come out and she'd say, so how are you going to pay for this? And you'd say, charge it to Walter Farms. What's your name? And all of us would say, Ben. She says, God, there's a lot of Bens around here. But anyway, George Walters would complain a little bit and pay for the bill. But I mean, that's how it worked back in them days. One big old family, lots of daddies, lots of mommies, and basically the ministers, the preachers, and Everything was ironed out every Sunday, lectured again, and back for another week at work. So I'd say Philip was a tremendous inspiration. He was tremendous with animals, and he always did his best, and he excelled. I remember, oh yeah, in the public school, there was the big shots in high school. They were, quote, they were the guys that told everybody else what to do, and if you didn't do it, they laid a good whipping on you. Well, not Philip. I remember the Chauffeur boys, yeah, the Chauffeur boys, they were the big shots. And today, Mr. Chauffeur is a police officer, and they were the big shots. And he was threatening Philip one day at school, telling him to do this or do that. Next thing you know, Philip had him pinned to the ground, and the hierarchy was established, and that was it. He could handle him with no problem. There was nobody in the Sterling school that even could touch him as far as strength. Nobody. Public school, he could whip any two guys at once. I remember one time Marty Hershey, he was the biggest, toughest guy in Sterling. And Philip was down picking up mail in the post office. So Marty jumps him in the post office. So Philip grabbed him, flipped him upside down, give him a big jerk, and I think he made him puke in the post office, then dropped him on a heap and took his mail and come home. And I remember coming home, he says, yeah, he says, I just fought Marty Hershey. I says, you're kidding. He says, he's the biggest guy in town. He says, yeah, he says, I turned him upside down and dropped him on his head. Them things actually happened. I seen my one cousin Oscar one time. There was six guys from town come out to our place and their car stopped. And they were yelling out the window, you want to fight? You want to fight? You Hooderites want to fight? And Oscar went over by himself, and every one of them, nobody would step out of the car. You know, there's lots of talk. But here's the thing, when you pitch thousands, tens of thousands of bales, you lift weights, you run, man, at 13 years old, 14 years old, there wasn't anybody I knew 25, 30 years old that you couldn't lay a whipping on. I remember they'd haul us into town and we'd arm wrestle for downfill jackets and stuff like that. Oh yeah, which reminds me, there was a guy in Fort Macleod that had a record. Nobody had beat him in an arm wrestle. And I remember Philip going over there and over the hood of a pickup, over the Chevy pickup, he told the guy, he says, well, I'm sure, he says, you'll lay a good whipping on me. But he says, I'd like to try you. Both arms he took them. And so there's always somebody faster. There's always somebody smarter. There's always somebody quicker. But you just do the best you can. So I'm sure after this I'll think of a lot of memories. Danny was a lot older than me, so I didn't have a lot of memories of him on the farm. Oh yeah, what I remember about him is we had this old army tractor. We called it the Federal. And the Federal was a 671 Jimmy with a straight pipe. You could hear, I would go to sleep at night as a kid, and you could hear this out on them 3,800 acres, and Danny would be working. I fell asleep many a time hearing that engine out there screaming. And I'd ask my dad, I says, Daddy, who's out on the big tractor? He said, that Danny. Danny, he worked into the night. A Federal with a 671 Jimmy and 24 feet of cultivator doing summer fallow on 3,800 acres. So he was a lot older and then wasn't in my group. But then he moved off the farm. I remember one day he had a real bad wreck with a 3-ton truck, and the cops and everybody was marveling that he wasn't killed in that wreck. Going over to the reserve, he drove over a cliff with the 3-ton truck, lost control. Yes, yes, yes. The other thing I remember about Philip is he'd date his girlfriend Susie down in Oregon, and he had this old Buick car, and he'd make it from Sterling, Alberta, down to Eugene, Oregon in 9.5 hours. He says a lot of times, he says, going down the Columbia Gorge, he says, I had that speedometer sunk 95, 100 miles an hour. He says, hour after hour. And he started dating her when she was 17. And I remember he would say, hey, when I'd come over to his place, he'd be laying in his bed reading these letters, and he'd let me read these few lines. Look what she says here. And you don't read more than this, just this line right here. And then he was all excited about her and couldn't wait to marry her. And so that was quite a love affair. And old Philip. So nothing but a lot of good memories. Yeah. If the whole world was like him, it would be a tremendous place to be. So his love, as I knew him before his family, was horses, being in shape, and lots of humor. He loved to laugh, always doing funny stuff and laughing. Always was a blast to be around. Hopefully I left you with a little bit of a picture. Bless y'all. You're awesome. The picture I seen there Judith Poole had of all them young ones, it just hit me in the gut. Man, these here are my buddies' grandchildren, and I don't even know them. And time goes by, and here I'm this old bearded grandpa, moved from southern Alberta, 42 years in southern Alberta, and now sitting down here in Kentucky. But anyway, hopefully this will cause you a little bit of memories. God bless you guys. Bye-bye.